Hey, what's happening, y'all? I'm jamixdowns with intessionmusictech, and just quickly want to let you know that this tutorial is actually part of a full vocal reverb mixing tutorial. So make sure you stay tuned for the entire video called the Vocal Reverb Mixing Masterclass here on the intessionmusictech YouTube channel. So with that being said, let's get into the video and let's get to work. So one thing I've noticed throughout all my years of teaching music production is that most people don't really understand how the settings of a reverb work and how to apply them correctly to get the best results. Most people generally get the basic understanding of the different reverb types, which is pretty easy for most people to get a grasp of. And number two, they'll play around with the decay times and just kind of leave their reverb education at that. And I think the main reason people tend to do this is because the rest of the settings seem to be a little too technical and they just don't want to be bothered with trying to learn how to use them. And another reason I know this to be true is because sadly I was actually once one of those people, and for longer than I care to admit, my reverb education came to a halt after I learned the different reverb types and a little bit about the decay times. But the main issue with that is that you'll never get a professional sounding vocal when you're just using those settings. To get a professional vocal sound, you have to understand and learn how to utilize all the reverb settings, and what I've come to find out is that they're actually not that difficult to understand. You just have to know the best way to learn how to use them, and there's actually a simple way of doing this, which I'm going to show you shortly when we get into the session. In this tutorial, we're going to cover the 5 key reverb settings and how they work towards getting you a better vocal sound. We're going to look at understanding decay, how to use pre-delay effectively, understanding diffusion, understanding damping, and understanding early reflections. And I know that it's common for a lot of reverb plugins to also include modulation settings. We're going to cover modulation in the lesson on adding effects to your reverb. So let's first take a look at understanding how decay affects our vocals. All right, y'all. So we're in the session, and the song that we're working on today is called Kendai Nahi, and the artist's name is Jasmine Sandless, and the producer's name is Karn Walia. And this, of course, is a Punjabi song, and a lot of you don't know Punjabi music is really hitting hard right now, and there's so much talent in that world, and these two are incredibly talented, and it's been a pleasure and an honor working with these two. All right, so the first thing that we're going to look at are decay times, and there's 2 important things that you have to understand with decay times when it comes to mixing vocals. And number 1, you generally actually want to avoid using longer decay times for vocals, and the main reason being is because this is the quickest way to actually muddy up your mix and muddy up everything else that's going on in the mix when you have longer decay times. And for me personally, I try not to do anything longer than a 3-second decay time to avoid this. Not saying that you can't have longer decay times, but you really have to be careful with this, and you really have to know what you're doing as far as treating it and EQing it. So this is something really important that you need to know when using decay times with your vocals. And number 2 is that you want to have the decay times in time with the beat, and this is just going to give you a better overall reverb sound as it blends in with the beat so much better. And I'm going to go over this in a lot more detail later on in the tutorial when I cover how to set your delay times in time with the beat. But for this section of the tutorial, I'm actually not going to go into that. I already have the delay time set. So the first thing that we're going to look at here is just understanding why longer decay times can cause problems when you're using reverb on your vocals. So I'm just going to pull up a reverb here. I have a large plate, and this is the one that we're going to use. I have Valhalla Vintage Verb, and I've set the decay time to 4.28 seconds, and this is essentially set to the quarter note of the tempo of this song. And what I'm going to do is just turn it up and let you hear how it sounds and how it can actually wash out the rest of the mix because of the long decay time. So just going to go back to my edit window, and we're going to play this beat, and I'm actually going to play it as the instrumental kicks in. So as we can see, that it's not that anything sounds wrong with that. It can sound good if that's the sound you're after, but the more reverb elements that you add in the mix, the more it's going to muddy up the mix. So I'm going to chop this decay time in half to 2.14. And this is essentially an eighth note decay time, and we're going to hear how this sounds. So as you can see, it's just not as washy, and the vocal still is giving that sense of space, but the reverb's not drowning out the rest of the mix. And this is so important when it comes to mixing vocals. So try and keep your decay time shorter, and this is one of the most important things that you need to understand when it comes to using decay on your vocals. And again, the second thing that we want to look at is making sure that the decay is in time. So I'm going to actually put this back. You can hear it a little bit better when the decay time is longer. So I'm going to put this to 4.28. And I'm going to turn this up, and just so you can see how the difference in the timing and making sure that your reverb is set to the tempo of the song can really make a big difference, especially moving forward when you start adding other effects to your reverbs. So essentially that decay time is fading out to the tempo of the song, so it just sounds much more pleasing when it's in time. So let me adjust this to a different decay time that's not in time. So as you can see, it's actually a big difference. You can hear that it's not timed. And one key thing that we're going to cover throughout this tutorial, the best way to start getting a handle on reverb, and this goes for mixing all across the board, but you have to exaggerate the reverb, and then you can really hear what all this stuff is doing. So throughout the course of this tutorial, I'm really going to be exaggerating these reverbs so you can hear what all of this stuff is doing. And this is the best way for you to practice and get a handle on reverb, is to really exaggerate it and see what these settings are doing for your reverb, and then bring it back down to taste. So these are the two important things that you have to understand when using decay on your vocals. And it's really easy. Again, I'm going to go over it later on in the tutorial as far as setting the reverb times, and then just avoiding trying to use longer decays, especially on lead vocals. And I understand that there's a lot of scenarios where you want to have a big washy reverb, and that's fine, but you just have to be careful with it on lead vocals. If you want a present lead vocal, avoid using longer decay times. And again, I normally don't even go over, I try not to go over a 3-second decay time. So doing these two things with your decay times is going to make your reverb sound so much better on your vocal. Pre-delay plays a really important role in how we control the vocal's sense of depth in the mix, meaning how forward the vocal will appear in the mix or how far back it will be in the mix. Pre-delay also controls the clarity of the vocal by controlling when the reverb engages on the vocal. And number 3, pre-delay also has a big part to play in how we creatively use reverb as well. So let's get into the session and see how this all works in action. So pre-delay is a really important aspect to use in reverb, just in general, but especially on vocals, because this is how we set the depth of our vocal in the mix. So this is how we're going to perceive how far back it's going to be, or how present we want it to be. And the way that it works is that the less pre-delay, if there is no pre-delay, that means the reverb is going to hit our vocal right away, therefore giving it the impression that it's further back in the mix, because that's what reverb does, is give it space. And if we set our pre-delay higher, the higher we give it, the longer it takes for the reverb to kick in. Therefore, when that vocal is first hitting, there's no delay, there's no reverb on it, making it more present and upfront. And I'm going to just quickly show you how this works. So I'm actually going to change this decay time back to, we'll actually do a longer decay time so you can hear it a little bit better. I'm going to go back to 4.28. And I'm just going to play it with no pre-delay, and you'll see that it just hits the vocal right away. Okay, so that's 0 millisecond pre-delay. So now I'm going to turn this pre-delay way up so you can hear that there's actually a delay on the reverb. So as you can see, the further I push this pre-delay, the less you can hear the reverb on the vocal, and it's making the vocal more present in the mix. So that's why pre-delay is so important. It determines the depth of the vocal in our mix. And to use this, the best way to use pre-delay is to go back to what we were talking about with timing. We want to make sure that we actually set the proper timing with the pre-delay to make it even more effective. So the way that we would do that is actually just by multiplying this decay time. This is a quarter note, and we can just keep multiplying that by 2 or 4 or by 10, and that's going to make sure that our pre-delay is in time. And again, I'm going to go over this in more detail later on in the tutorial as far as setting times to your reverb. But as you can see, pre-delay makes a huge difference in how this vocal is going to sit in the mix. So let's just check this out one more time. That's the other cool thing with pre-delay. When you set longer pre-delay times, it's actually a great creative tool because we can have the reverb in those spaces if we want. But again, because our decay time is longer, we need to be careful with that because it could wash out the mix and make the mix a little bit muddier. But these are things that you can also do with pre-delay. So let's just check that out one more time. So the pre-delay essentially is like using a delay on your reverb. So those are things that you can play around with. But as you can see, pre-delay is really important to dialing in our reverb on our vocals and how we set the depth and how present it's going to be in the vocal. So very important. So it's really crucial that you understand what diffusion is and how it works. And it's really a common feature on reverb plugins, but never really gets utilized by new mixers. So diffusion is sometimes labeled as density or shape and usually controls both the dispersion of the reflections and their density. So with more diffusion, the reverb sounds thicker, smoother, and generally more washy. And with lower levels of diffusion, the reverb will generally sound thinner, sometimes to the point where it can't even be heard. And lower diffusion settings are associated with what we would call more regular shaped rooms or empty rooms, in which the reflections bounce from surface to surface in a pretty consistent manner. And the higher diffusion settings are associated with rooms that have an irregular shape or rooms that contain a greater range of surfaces and objects for the sound to reflect and bounce off of. So what you really need to know is that when applying diffusion to your vocals is that highly diffused reverbs can actually sound somewhat impressive, but they can also cause your mix to lose clarity and sound washed out. Lowering the diffusion can really be useful in retaining definition and preventing the reverb from overpowering the mix, but always remember to keep in mind that lowering the diffusion too much can make the reverb sound metallic and just really unpleasant and somewhat unnatural. So now that you have a better understanding of diffusion, let's get into the session and check out how diffusion affects your vocals in action. All right, so the next thing we're going to look at is diffusion and how diffusion affects our vocals when we're using reverb. And on this particular plugin, you can see we have the shape setting here, and then the DIFF is for diffusion, but this is actually early and late reflections, and we're going to go over that a little bit later in this tutorial. Right now, we're going to actually use the shape. This is essentially sets the relative room size of the reverb and can make a huge difference in how your reverb affects the vocal. So let's just play around with this. So as you can see, that made a huge difference in how that reverb sounded and how that shaped its vocals. So when I pulled the size back, that just opened everything up and made the reverb in the room so much bigger. And of course, that's not going to be good as far as washing out the mix and adding mud to our mix. So again, this is one of those key elements of reverb. And as you can see, this stuff, it's not very technical. But what you have to do is just make sure you exaggerate the reverb so you hear what it's doing to the signal, and then it's a lot easier to figure out exactly what it is and what it's doing. So let's just hear that one more time. So again, if you are using a reverb that has this setting, then this is a really key setting to play around with when you're dialing in your reverb. So that is diffusion and shape, adjusting the relative size of the room with the particular vocal setting or reverb type that you're using within that context. Damping is also a really crucial setting to reverb and plays a major role in how your vocals are going to sit in the mix. But luckily, using damping is actually pretty easy to understand and apply once we know what it is. And the best way to understand damping is by looking at it as an EQ, because damping essentially controls the absorption of the high and low end frequencies that reverbs produce, which an EQ actually does this as well, but we'll discuss this later on in the tutorial. So most important to understand about damping is that high frequencies decay faster than low frequencies and generally need to be controlled more when applying reverb to your vocals. So always keep in mind that the precise control of damping plays a major role in how your vocals are going to sit in the mix, because this is how we control the brightness and the darkness of our reverb. So now that we have an overview of damping, let's get into the session and see how this all works in action. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is damping, and I think the best way to explain this is to look at it as an EQ, because that's essentially what it's doing is lowering the high-end frequencies and the low-end frequencies of the reverb tails. So I'm actually just going to pull in this EQ here, and this is actually on the reverb track. And I'm going to show you essentially what damping is doing, because this particular reverb, you're just adjusting the controls, but you can't visually see it. So I'm just going to play this reverb, and I'm going to pull in a shelf, because this is essentially what this is doing, and this is going to dampen the high-end frequencies of this reverb. And the reason why damping is important is because those high-end frequencies, again, this is all relative to your mix, but they can really get in the way of your vocal and the rest of your mix. So EQing and damping these frequencies is really important to cleaning up your reverb to get a nice present vocal but still giving it the space and the depth that you want. So again, this is high-end frequencies that I was doing, and I just put a shelf on it, and it's the same with the low-end frequencies. Essentially, we'd be using a shelf and damping the low-end frequencies, and we'll get more into that when we get into EQing reverb. But damping is essentially a form of EQing your reverb, and that's the best way to explain it for you guys to understand it. So again, I'm going to play this track, and I'm just going to apply this high shelf here. So I've pulled down those high frequencies, those high tails to 4300. So again, it's just like pulling down a shelf on an EQ. And this is how we tame and kind of shape our EQ and our vocal to sit in the mix the way that we want it. Because again, if I pull this back and you hear all those high-end frequencies, that's not good for our mix. And again, I have this reverb exaggerated. Of course, I wouldn't use it this loud, but this is the best way for you guys to be able to hear what all this stuff is doing. And so I'm going to just pull this back. So as you can see, that makes a huge difference. And then conversely, these bass frequencies is essentially putting a shelf on the low end frequencies. I have it here set to 750. So the shelf would be set to 750 hertz. And this is pulling down all those bass frequencies. So let's hear how this sounds. So again, this damping is just essentially acting as a reverb. But as you can see, this is really, really crucial on how you're going to shape your reverb sound, because those long tails, if they're not controlled, they're just going to wash out your mix and muddy everything up. So damping is very, very important element when using reverb on your vocals. Using and understanding early reflections is probably the last element of a reverb that people learn, and that's if they even end up learning it at all. Because for one, a lot of reverbs actually just don't have the setting, and two, it's just very difficult for people to see how this can really get them better results in their mixes. But everything has its purpose and its place and wouldn't be there if it wasn't important. So early reflections are the reflections that reach the listener a few milliseconds after the direct signal arrives, and our brains use them to identify the size of the room that we're in. So when we're trying to emulate a specific space or room, early reflections actually play a really big role in this. So essentially, the louder the early reflection, the smaller the room will seem, and conversely, the quieter the early reflections, the larger the room will sound. So now that we have more of an understanding of early reflections, let's get into the session and see how this all works on our vocals. Okay, so now we're going to look at early reflections, and this is probably the most subtle of all of the reverb settings and isn't going to crazily affect your reverb sound, but it's still important to know these settings. They all have their place in reverb, and the more that you get into reverb, the more that you need to understand all this stuff, as it all adds up over time, like everything in mixing. So here we have our section, and these are early and late reflections. So essentially, the louder this early reflection, the smaller the perceived room size is going to be within the context of whatever reverb type that you've chose. So let's play around with this early deflection and early reflection, and see how it sounds on the vocal. So when I pull this early reflection back, you can hear that it's making the room space of the vocal sound bigger. So let's listen to this one more time. So what it's doing is just making the perceived room size sounding a little bit bigger. As you can see, it's not making drastic changes to the reverb, but it is there and it is subtle and it is something that you can use to dial in your reverb. So let's check out what the late reflections are also doing here. As you can see, it says it controls the rate at which the echo density builds over time. So let's hear how this is affecting our vocal. You can hear we're even actually getting some distortion in that reverb when I'm pulling this all the way back. So again, all of this stuff does matter. And again, even though this is a little more subtle, you can see that it can add distortion to the signal when I pull this all the way back. So let's hear that one more time. So as you can see, this is really affecting the density of that reverb. When I pull it back, it sounds a lot thinner. And then the more I go towards 100%, it's a lot denser. So let's just hear that one more time. So as you can see, it can make a big difference in how you're shaping your reverb. And again, this is early reflections and late reflections. And not a lot of reverbs have this, but once you start getting more into reverb, then a lot of the more advanced reverb plugins are going to have all these settings for you guys to play around with. So now that we've gone through all of the settings on these more advanced reverb plugins, you can hear how big of a difference that it makes in shaping your reverb sound and how your vocal is going to sit in the mix. So try and get out of your comfort zone when it comes to using reverbs and just finding a reverb type like a hall or a church and then just adjusting your decay. It goes much, much further than that, shaping your reverb. And this is how you're going to get a much more professional lead vocal sound. And it's not just lead vocals, it's just everything. Understanding all this stuff applies to all mixing across the board, whether it's just vocals or instruments. So now that you have a better understanding of these settings, you're going to be able to take your vocal mixes to a whole nother level.